The sun scorched the earth with a relentless breath, as if the very sky conspired to press down upon a land weighted by invisible chains. In the heart of this sweltering 1841 summer, a child named Mary entered a world where every texture was laced with hardship and every moment rehearsed in the cadence of survival. Her earliest memories were stitched with the brush of coarse linen against her skin, the heavy iron girds locked around ankles, and the ceaseless hum of commanding voices beneath the rustling of ancient oaks. How could a spirit endure such suffocating heat and still harbor the embers of rebellion beneath a calm exterior? Mary's life began not with lullabies, but with the sharp, unforgiving rhythm of plantation drills, the clatter of wood-soled feet, the scrape of tools against earth, the sting of lash beds pressed into willing backs. The estate's manor loomed large, a specter of symmetry and severity, its wooden boards groaning under the weight of the centuries and the secrets held tight within. The scent of lamp oil and wood smoke clung to every corner, mingling with the bitter tang of sweat and the faint, unyielding scent of chains. Mary's small hands traced the patterns of knots in the rope that bound her father, fashioned from rough hemp that bit into his flesh. This legacy of captivity shaped her breath, coating it with a tension as palpable as the stillness before a storm. The sound of the master's order fractured the air, a sonorous declaration that ordered bodies and wills without mercy. Each day was a test of endurance beneath merciless sun and watchful eyes. Mary's gaze, sharp and guarded, flickered between the shadows where whispered tales of escape were exchanged. She learned early that knowledge was a weapon. Even the smallest piece of forbidden information, a name, a herb, a flaw in a lock, was a flicker of hope. Yet what hope could take root when the law rendered her a chattel, a thing to be commanded without error? In this scorched silence, she nurtured a quiet defiance that no lash could erase. Would you imagine growing under skies thick with smoke, knowing each breath could carry despair or revolt? Mary's furtive observations went beyond survival. They birthed a simmering unrest. Her mother's voice, barely a whisper under the weight of fear, told stories of a freedom unseen but fervently hoped for, a land of light beyond these iron chains. The memory of those tales pressed heavily against Mary's chest, a delicate seed in cracked earth, waiting for the storm to break. But storms here were as much human as they were natural, and cruelty was as common as the cotton that bled the fields white. The rhythm of the seasons marked the turning pages of her existence, each harvest more brutal than the last. The plantation's unforgiving economy was written in rows of cotton and the silent ledger of broken bodies. The law's long, cold hand ensured that rebellion was met with death or worse, public spectacle sealed tight with humiliation. Early on, Mary bore witness to the fates of those who dared rise, tongues torn, bodies suspended from great oaks, flesh branded with hot irons, a theater of punishment played out beneath the indifferent sky. The horrors were not just to break bodies, but to shatter hope, yet Mary's fire burned stubbornly beneath layers of imposed silence. One evening, as a heavy door creaked closed behind the master's retinue, Mary's gaze lingered on a locket worn beneath the folds of her mother's dress, an object forbidden, a relic of a life before chains. The small iron clasp clicked shut with a sound like finality, sealing away not just metal, but the fragile threads of family and freedom. This moment, so humble and overlooked, was where rebellion first breathed, unseen, in the cold clasp of iron. The ledger of her youth leaves gaps there, silent about the precise origins of Mary's fierce resolve, yet accounts suggest her family's fate at the hands of the master's wrath planted a seed that no cruelty could uproot. In the quiet moments between toil and torment, Mary's hands trembled slightly, part weariness, part rage, when she fingered the coarse fabric of her worn skirt. The coarse weave scratched her skin like the daily reminders of captivity. The Manor's oppressive presence was an omnipresent weight, its creaking hinges and locked shutters echoing the unyielding confines of her world. And yet beneath the pressing oak boughs, a cold draft whispered promises of change, of revolt kindling beneath the surface. This was a life lived in measured steps, in silences punctuated by distant cries, and in the watching of faces hardened by the same merciless sun. What makes a soul decide to defy the furnace of such relentless oppression? For Mary, it was the slow-burning injustice inflicted on all she loved, the stolen smiles of siblings, the shattered prayers of elders, the knowing glance passed between those who bore witness to the master's cruelty. Her rebellion was not born in the sudden flare of anger, but in the long, smoldering accumulation of pain and an iron-hard determination to rewrite the script of her existence. With every locked door and whispered threat, her small heart beat the rhythm of resistance, an unspoken question echoing through the plantation's humid air. Could chains forged from iron also bind the will of fire? Poisonous knowledge. In the simmering heat of the plantation's late summer, Mary's hands were steady, though her heart thudded with a secret rhythm no one else could hear. The world around her smelled of crushed leaves and damp earth, a scent heavy with both healing and hidden death. She had discovered a clandestine wisdom passed down in whispered legends among those who bent beneath the iron gaze of their owners. The quiet power of plants, herbs, and resinous roots. It was knowledge that could soothe a feverish child or steal the breath of a cruel master, depending on the hand that wielded it. What poison lurked beneath the guise of medicine? This knowledge was often intertwined with fear, for among the slave quarters, stories circulated of retribution wrought through subtle toxins. Bitter infusions meant not to slay outright, but to weaken and terrify. Accounts suggest Mary had learned from an elder woman whose hands trembled, not from age but from the weight of forbidden secrets. The woman showed her how a saphatida, known for its fetid odor likened to devil's dung, could be distilled to clear obstructed airways or serve as a choking agent. Turpentine, a pine resin with a sharp resinous sting, was whispered to fiendishly aid these concoctions, easing their passage within a victim's body like a ghost slipping through fragile veins. Yet, the line between poison and medicine was perilously thin. Strychnine, the white powder reputed to provoke agonizing spasms, could be prescribed in tiny doses to stimulate the weary heart, and aconite, the queen of poisons, carried a legacy steeped in myth and shadow, its burning touch remembered in whispered warnings. Mary's apprenticeship in this dark pharmacy was as much about survival as revolution, her love for those she protected entwined with the grim calculus of lethality. Would you trust in a leaf that could cure or kill? In the glow of low oil lamps, Mary's fingers learned to weigh leaves and roots, to gauge the smallest pinch that would bend the will of her oppressors without shattering the fragile hope of mercy. The ledger of these poisons was as bound in mystery as the plantation's ledger books were to cotton and debts, precise details of use often obscured by silence and fear. The very threat of such knowledge made overseers suspicious, their patrols tightening like iron bands as Mary moved beneath their gaze, her calm exterior belying the storm gathering within. With each measured step, Mary's understanding deepened, not only of the herbs but of the human body under duress. She observed how certain mixtures could dull pain or induce rest, even hallucinations, tools both for healing and subversion. And yet, the grim necessity of choosing when to protect and when to punish weighed heavily on her, a moral riddle wrapped in the musk of damp bark and bitter resin. The poison jar balanced precariously on a shelf beside the remedies, a silent question hanging in the thick air. Can the oppressed administer justice without becoming the oppressor? Mary's journey into this shadowed realm of botanical alchemy was more than the acquisition of skill. It was an initiation into a hidden language of power. Each scent of crushed herb, each texture of powder, held promise and peril alike. In the confines of her cramped dwelling, amid muffled whispers of rebellion, she prepared for a reckoning that would lock doors and bend fates. The slow hiss of iron chains was never far from her mind, a reminder that freedom's price was paid in blood, poison, and the resolute silence of those who dared defy. The stillness of that summer night was shattered, not by thunder, but by the ripple of whispered plans and the scent of sweat mingling with the pungent smoke of burning pine. Mary moved with a calculated grace beneath the twisted limbs of oaks that guarded the manor, her fingers slick with the residue of crushed leaves and bitter sap. The poison she prepared was not a blunt instrument, but a serpent's subtle kiss, measured, precise, a powder to slip unnoticed into food and drink. The kitchen was alive with the clatter of spoons and murmured prayers, but Mary's heart beat a secret rhythm heavier than any drum. The food she touched was laced with lethal intent, each grain mixed with quiet fury and desperate hope. A faint swirl of dye from crushed herbs, the bitter trail of aconite masked by the sweet heft of molasses. It was an alchemy darker than any medicine. The master dined with unchecked arrogance, his laughter slicing through the humid air like a whip, unaware that each morsel carried the sharp edge of rebellion. Outside, the manor's loyal dogs stirred uneasily, sensing a shift in the invisible currents of power that governed the estate. Could a single meal turn the tide of oppression? Mary's hands betrayed no tremor as she poured poison into the goblets, destined for those who sat ensconced in their false security. Her gaze was fixed on the flickering candlelight that cast long, dancing shadows across his polished wooden face, a face too long accustomed to dominance and denial. The poison's scent was nearly imperceptible, a faint earthiness beneath the richer spices of the feast. It clung to the air like a whispered threat, a silent promise that something would change irrevocably before the night's end. Yet in Mary's chest, a knotted storm churned, hope tempered by fear, defiance veiled with dread. Would you find yourself at the edge of vengeance, haunted by the question, what cost will the pursuit of justice claim? As the poisoned wine slid down throats thick with arrogance, the first shivers of sickness wove through the manor's grand hall. The master's laughter died slow and ragged, replaced by a clench of fists and glass clattering against oak. One by one, pallor spread like a ghost's touch across once proud faces. Panic surged beneath the brittle veneer of order, fracturing calm into chaos. Mary, unseen, felt the tremor of power shift beneath her feet, a fragile but undeniable claim, paid in whispered breaths and stolen moments. The manor's walls, so often silent witnesses to cruelty and command, began to echo with the unsettled stirrings of profound upheaval. Mary's secret act was both shield and sword, a counterpoint to the iron chains that circled her world. In these fractures of control, the air thickened with suspicion, the trust once granted to routine shattered like thin glass. Locked doors and barred windows took on new meaning as symbols not just of confinement, but of a desperate promise. The night belonged, if only briefly, to those who dared seize it. What futures could be forged behind those bolted panels? As the crisis escalated, Mary's decision to lock the manor's heavy wooden doors from within became an act that transformed her from shadow to storm. The iron latch clicked sharp and final, sealing the fate of all inside, slave and master alike. Outside, the air hung heavy with tension, the scent of damp earth and burning pine mingling with the metallic tang of fear. Whispers swelled among the enslaved, words that raced like wildfire in the dark, grappling with hope and dread. For the first time, silenced voices raced together, claiming space and demanding reckoning. The night burned vivid, a crucible where chains were tested and destinies forged. The master's guards pressed against the door, their fists pounding with a desperation born of shattered certainty. The sound echoed through the humid night, sharp as the glint of the overseer's whip in torchlight. Mary stood steady, chest rising and falling in time with the voices trapped behind her barricade. Here, beneath the oppressive moon and watchful stars, she faced the crucible of rebellion, a precipice where courage and consequence collided. The iron chains had closed tight once more, but this time, they bore the imprint of a resolute hand. The question hung thick in the heat-soaked air: would this night mark the end or the beginning of freedom? The manor's heavy door groaned under the strain of countless winters, its iron hinges protesting like the last breath of a weary sentinel. On a night smothered in the thick humidity of August, Mary's resolve was tested as she moved to lock away the tyranny that had long caged her spirit. The echoes of laughter and clinking glasses spilled from the great hall behind her, voices wrapped in privilege and ignorance, oblivious to the storm gathering on the other side. Her fingers pressed against the cool iron latch, every sound suspended in a breathless moment before the final, decisive click. Inside, The air was thick with the scent of roasted meats and spiced wine, mingling with the faint perfume of tri-leather-bound books and waxed floors. The master and his circle held dominion over the space as if no force could unseat their presumption, their ease a fragile veneer over centuries of blood and labor. Beyond the polished surfaces, quickened heartbeats stirred beneath poised expressions as unease crept through the crowd, like a shadow slipping through candlelight. Would the walls that confined them also betray them? Mary's eyes, sharp and unyielding, watched the flicker of torch flames reflected in window panes, shuttered tight against the sultry night. Outside, the heavy air pressed down like an iron lid on a boiling cauldron, the distant rustle of leaves, a whispered hymn to latent revolt. Each step she took was deliberate, weighted by the knowledge that this act, this turning of lock to bolt, was more than physical confinement. It was the shattering of an unspoken truce, a declaration that the old order's reign was fragile and fleeting. How long would the manor hold its captives before terror fractured the silence? The door's final thud resonated like a tolling bell, sealing not just wood and iron, but centuries of power and pain. The master's sudden halt, the hush that fell over the room, betrayed a dawning awareness. Walls that once promised safety now felt like a tomb. Panic murmured beneath composed faces. Right before it surged, clenched jaws slackened, breaths quickened, eyes darted with sharp suspicion. Mary's heart steadied amidst the growing tumult, her hands cold but unshaken. In that closing moment, the iron chains of fate clattered audibly, each link a testament to the rebellion born of necessity. Would you find your courage when the night grew thick with dread, and every shadow seemed a threat? Behind closed doors, the claustrophobia twisted tightly, voices strained against the wooden fortress, a chorus of fear and anger rising like smoke. The slaves' whispers outside pressed close, a palpable surge against the stifling silence within. The manor was a crucible, a cage transformed into a battlefield of wills, where liberty was measured by the strength of a single turning bolt. The scent of smoked pine mingled with the damp of pressed earth, as if nature herself exhaled in anticipation. Locked inside were not mere bodies, but the brittle illusions of supremacy and control. Against the weight of the sultry night and the iron that sealed them in, Mary stood steady like the ancient oaks surrounding the estate, enduring, rooted, ready. The manor's shadows stretched long, casting distorted shapes that merged past and present, captivity and courage. The doors were shut, the house was hers now, if only for a breath. And while the iron chains could bind flesh, they could not bind a will carved from the same iron wills that forged them. Within the sealed manor, the air thickened with a stifling fear that clung like damp cloth to every trembling breath. The poisoned feast took hold slowly but inexorably. Pallor replaced pride, sweat-slicked brows once flushed with arrogance. The master's once commanding voice faltered beneath growing waves of nausea and weakness, the weight of unseen toxin settling like a creeping fog over his limbs. Shadows lengthened on the walls, distorted figures blurred behind flickering candlelight, and the grand hall transformed into an unspoken trap where power melted into helplessness. Confined yet restless, the white inhabitants grappled with their loss of control, their eyes darting to locked doors as if desperate to will them open by sheer force of will. The heavy wooden beams seemed to press inward, bearing silent witness to their crumbling dominion. Meanwhile, outside those walls, the enslaved moved in hushed solidarity, their footsteps merging with the night's chorus of cicadas and rustling leaves. Mary's act had fractured the usual order, turning the manor into a paradoxical fortress where both captives and captors found themselves imprisoned by fate. How do spirits endure when both freedom and captivity are shackled? Mary stood apart, the storm of her own breathing steady despite the crushing weight of consequence. Her hands once nimble in the kitchen, now clenched with the residue of resolve and guilt. She could almost taste the iron tang of fear, thicker than any blood. In those hours, the manor was a crucible where silence morphed into screams left unsaid, where the echo of broken power reverberated louder than any clash of weaponry. What she had done was not a simple rebellion, but a reckoning, a moment suspended between hope and despair beneath the oppressive heat and heavy oak shadows. Would you bear the burden of liberation weighed against the cost of those ensnared by your choices? The ritual of suffering played out quietly, pale faces pressed to polished tables, hands trembling against carved wood as the poisoned bodies waged battles unseen. Beneath the stillness, a roiling tension pulsed, a fragile balance threatening to snap beneath the pressure of seething outrage and whispered prayers. The manor's walls, slick with the scent of sweat and bitter herbs, seemed to close tighter with each shallow breath, trapping secrets as much as flesh. In these hours, the iron chains motif deepened its grip, not only as physical bonds, but as the invisible threads that linked every soul to the legacy of captivity and resistance. The carved iron latch on the great door, the delicate ironwork of the chandelier above, the rusted clasps of forgotten shackles, each bore silent testimony to a history interwoven with subjugation and the flickering flames of revolt. Mary's gaze lifted to the heavy beams overhead, where the faint creak of settling wood felt like a whispered question. What price must be paid when power is unseated, if not the slow unraveling of the soul itself? This night, stitched together by fear, willpower, and imprisonment, laid the fragile foundation for a saga wherein oppression and rebellion danced in relentless shadow. The manor no longer belonged to the master alone. It was a battleground of wills, a place where the unseen pulse of resistance beat fiercely beneath weary flesh. In that unyielding air, the iron chains were heard not as mere instruments of bondage, but as the rhythms of a fate yet unwritten. The closing moment lingered like a breath held tight, poised on the edge of irrevocable change. The arrival of the overseer was like a cold gust slipping through the hot, heavy air of the plantation, a sudden shift in temperature and tension that sent restless quivers through every soul present. His boots struck the dirt in measured, menacing cadence, the sharpened echoes of authority that demanded attention and submission. His eyes, sharp and unforgiving, swept over Mary with a cruel certainty, calibrated for punishment and control. The overseer's voice cut through the murmur of chaos, like a whip's crack, sharp and unyielding. There was no room for sympathy in his commands, only swift and merciless reprisal. His fists clenched as he surveyed the shivering figures locked behind heavy doors, each face a reflection of fractured power and raw fear. To him, Mary was a spark threatening to ignite a tinderbox of revolt, and his calculus was clear: prevent the blaze at all costs. His hands were instruments of terror, wielding punishment with an unflinching resolve, meting out lashings and threats that echoed through timbered halls heavy with unease. Beneath the overseer's cold gaze, Mary's silhouette remained steady, her breath slow and measured despite the crushing weight of impending wrath. The cruel logic of rebellion bore down. Was this to be the end or the beginning of something larger? The overseer's threats left the air brittle, a sharp contrast to the humid night pressing against the manor's ancient walls. Would fear alone suffice to crumble the fragile alliance forged in whispered resistance, or would the iron chains of oppression crack beneath the heat of rebellion? His reign of terror took shape not only through physical punishment, but through a psychological siege. The overseer shattered trust with raised voices, cruel laughter, and the ever-present crack of the whip, a sound as familiar and feared as the slow, oppressive tick of time itself. Shadows lengthened as punishment wove through the night, each strike a message scorched into flesh and memory alike. Yet beneath the veneer of dominance, even the harshest enforcers harbored the knowledge that rebellion's seeds were planted deep, watered by pain, and propelled by the will to survive. In those fraught hours, the dynamic of master and servant twisted into a grotesque ballet of terror and defiance. Mary's defiance was met with brutality, but her silence and composure became sharper weapons than any lash. The overseer's fury was a tempest contained only by the manor's walls, but in his rage, cracks began to show, fleeting moments of doubt and fear that those beneath him, unseen and underestimated, wielded dangers far beyond the strike of cane or threat of chain. The weight of iron and fear was heavy, but beneath it stirred a spirit unbroken and poised for reckoning. In the restless twilight of the plantation's quarters, the air hung heavy with the mingled aromas of damp earth, crushed leaves, and struggling humanity. Mary moved quietly, amid the low murmur of whispered prayers and subdued coughs, a figure etched in resolve and shadow. The small collection of herbs, roots, and bitter tinctures she carried was both a testament to survival and a subtle defiance, medicine twinned with memory and coded in secrecy. The ancient knowledge of healing mingled uneasily with the latent power of poison, suspended in tinctures that could cure or condemn. The plantation doctor, a figure cloaked in both authority and ambiguity, held a fragile dominion over life and death. His touch was clinical, but detached, his prescriptions often veiled in suspicion as to whether they alleviated pain or prolonged suffering designed to serve control. Accounts suggest he balanced delicate alliances, but his medicine rarely challenged the iron order. Mary observed him closely, noting how remedies were measured and rationed, the added pinch of laudanum to dull restlessness, a smear of calomel that purged, and the occasional bittersweet of quinine to ward fevers. Each dose was a careful negotiation between relief and restraint. Within this uneasy space, memory and medicine collided. The oral histories carried by enslaved women preserved a wealth of healing arts, lovingly passed through generations beneath the constant shadow of surveillance. Mary's own learning was a coded transmission, the scent of mint to soothe cramps, the sticky viscosity of honey mixed with crushed ginger, and the dark resin of pine sap that both cleaned and cauterized wounds. Yet alongside these curatives lay warnings, the white hellebor's deadly allure, the aconite's burning sting, and the subtle lethality hidden beneath seemingly innocent petals. Would you trust in a remedy that conceals the threat of death in its very essence? Mary's fingers traced the rough fibers of cloth bundles containing her precious secret pharmacopoeia, each leaf and powder, a fragment of hope and hazard combined. The struggle to maintain this knowledge under the constant gaze of overseers turned healing into resistance, the act of caring into silent rebellion. Medicine was a language spoken softly, but wielded fiercely, a dance between preservation and protection, survival and subversion. In this delicate balance, the lines blurred. The same hand that soothed a fevered brow could prepare the bitter draught that altered the course of lives forever. The night deepened, and with it, Mary's resolve. The flicker of lantern light caught the sheen of crushed herbs and the wetness of ground bark. In these small acts lay the power to disrupt the cruel cycle of dominance. The manor was far removed from these whispered ministrations, yet even there, the echo of this medicine reached unseen, a quiet testament to the enduring strength of body and spirit. The ledger of history may obscure these acts, but in the shadows of memory, they remain vivid, living testament to the healing and harming intertwined beneath the vast, heavy oaks. The plantation was a living web woven with whispered rumors, threads as delicate as the silken strands of spiderwebs, yet potent enough to ignite fear and fracture alliances. Within this murmur, Mary's name took on a life of its own, spun from fragments of truth and the fertile soil of hearsay. In hushed tones under the thick canopy of magnolias, stories flew like moths to faint candlelight, some vested in hope, others coded in terror. The whispered image of a woman who poisoned her master and locked the manor stirred both dread and dark awe, blurring lines between fact and myth. The gossip did more than merely circulate. It warped the very atmosphere, casting shadows that lengthened with each retelling. Old women in cracked rocking chairs spoke of curses hidden in her touch, while young children dared not speak her name aloud, believing it summoned vengeance. The rumor mill churned relentlessly. Was Mary a villain or a heroine, a broken woman or a symbol of indomitable strength? Each retelling layered nuance, contradiction, and fear into a tapestry where truth dissolved into fearful speculation. What weight do stories carry when memory is the only record? Mary herself was a silent figure amid the storm. Her presence felt more than seen, a flickering shadow at the edges of paranoia and desire. The line between her real actions and the legend they spawned dissolved beneath the oppressive heat and tangled vines that wrapped the plantation. The manor echoed with the clink of iron and low murmurs, a place where reality twisted with the unpredictable currents of rumor and suspicion. Would you find solace in truth or power in myth when both can cage the human soul? The gossip's words acted as a weapon, fragmenting trust between slaves and overseers, planting seeds of doubt that sprouted into fractures of fear and defiance. The overseers' watchful eyes grew sharper, their suspicions heavier as the stories spread, a silent siege against the fragile equilibrium of power. Through this cacophony of whispers, Mary's story became a living thing, both shield and sword, obscuring her true fate while amplifying the anxieties of the ruling class. In this volatile atmosphere, silence was as loud as screams, and shadowy truths wielded sharper edges than any blade. In the stifling stillness of the night, amidst the rustle of magnolia leaves and flickering lamp oil, the tale of Mary was retold again and again, never quite the same. It was a story that demanded reckoning, seeding questions that lingered like smoke. Who really held power when fear could shutter doors and poison breaths? The mansion's iron chains may have locked bodies inside, but the rumor-spun chains outside wove an invisible prison, one from which escape was as complicated as the tangled vines that danced beneath the moonlight. The iron grip of the law crashed down upon the plantation like a relentless storm, unyielding and indiscriminate in its fury. Slave codes etched into the fabric of Southern society were merciless instruments designed to suppress rebellion and enforce obedience. Mary's act of defiance was not merely a breach of etiquette, but a capital crime, a calculated transgression against both property and authority. Within this austere legal framework, the scales of justice were forever tilted, its balance weighed by fear and the preservation of power over human dignity. The trial, a spectacle bound to unfold beneath the cold gaze of judges and overseers, was less about truth than demonstration, a grim ritual to deter uprising. Records imply that these proceedings bore all the semblance of law, but lacked its substance. Fairness was a veneer quickly stripped away beneath the harsh glare of prejudice. Mary's fate, like those before her, was sealed by statutes that denied her voice while condemning her to silence. The judge's hammer bore down as iron and cruelty intertwined, laws codified to crush resistance, even at the cost of justice itself. Punishments for rebellion were severe and symbolic, designed to instill terror not only in the punished, but in any who might dare emulate. Branding irons scorched flesh with indelible marks, chains clattered with heavy finality, and the lash tore not just skin, but the spirit. The ledger of colonial laws revealed a litany of horrors meted against the enslaved: public whippings, mutilations, and in the darkest corners, executions whose shadows still linger in whispered memory. Yet, within these brutal acts of punishment, Mary's story carried the seeds of resistance, a testament that even beneath the lash, will could remain unbroken. Would the law's blind severity extinguish the fire burning within the hearts of the oppressed, or merely fan its flames? Mary's trial planted questions that echoed far beyond the courtroom's cold stones. Each broken bone and heated iron was a punctuation mark in a narrative of domination and defiance, a reminder that the chains of law were as much psychological as physical. The paradox of justice under enslavement lay bare. It was a system designed not to protect all lives equally, but to preserve a brutal hierarchy writ large upon flesh and soul. In the heavy silence, following the verdict, the chill of iron and inevitability settled over the manor and beyond. The oppressive weight of law and punishment was a grim guardian of the plantation order, yet Mary's actions whispered a counterpoint, a stubborn hope that beneath the codified cruelty, rebellion stirred still. Her story, etched in scars and whispered lore, illuminated the dark intersections where law, violence, and humanity collided. Here, the iron chains of power clattered loudest, not just in the tempest of revolt, but in the enduring clash for freedom's fragile promise. The iron grip of Southern law settled over Mary's rebellion like a merciless shadow, codifying fear and control with cold precision. Slave codes, intricate and ruthless, prescribed punishments that ranged from brutal public executions to lifelong torment, each designed to crush any spark of resistance before it could take hold. Mary's defiance, poisoning, and confinement was not merely a crime, but an assault on the fragile order upon which the plantation's authority rested. The law's face was unyielding, blind to humanity, and fiercely protective of dominion. Trials for rebels were spectacle and sentence frozen in one, their outcomes rarely in doubt, a grim theater where innocence was irrelevant. Accounts imply Mary's voice was silenced, her humanity erased beneath layers of legal cruelty. Statutes demanded swift and symbolic justice, branding iron-seared flesh as visual warnings. Chains, both physical and symbolic, rattled with the weight of subjugation. Whippings tore beyond skin into spirit. These acts were carefully choreographed to instill terror, to remind every enslaved person of the fate awaiting rebellion. Yet paradoxically, punishment became a crucible forging wills unbroken. The colony's harshest laws forbade slaves from learning to read, assembling freely, or possessing weapons, as authorities sought total dominion. Enslaved folks faced death for minor transgressions. Escape attempts and uprisings returned severe consequences. Would the callous severity of this legal cage extinguish the yearning for freedom, or merely deepen the fire beneath? Mary's trial left an indelible mark, a testament to the brutality inherent in a system designed to deny justice to some while privileging others. The aftermath rippled beyond law. Plantation order reasserted with iron and fear. Overseers tightened grip, and laws grew even harsher. Yet beneath this ruthless suppression, Mary's story became a whispered flame, igniting courage in others. This layered conflict between law's cruelty and human will was not merely a historical footnote, it was a collision where iron chains could break, but spirit refused to yield. Within the suffocating stillness of the locked manor, silence became its own tormentor, thickening the humid air with an unbearable weight. Faces, once flushed with arrogance, now drained of color, pressed into polished wood or fevered palms. The faint scent of a poison uncoiling its slow work intertwined with the acrid tang of sweat and fear. Each shallow breath was a trembling testament to bodies caught in the cruel limbo between life and an uncertain death. The feverish trembling of limbs, the nauseous twisting of stomachs, these were the slow unravelings of power undone. Throughout the hall, whispers of panic rippled like sudden gusts, eyes darting, fingers gripping the edges of tables. The master's voice, once a booming decree, faltered into fragmented gasps. The guards' heavy boots echoed hollowly as they struggled to maintain composure behind the thick wood and iron bolts. Outside, the enslaved congregated in secreted places, the rustling of leaves and the chilling chorus of cicadas their silent allies. Mary's gambit had transformed the manor from fortress to trap, a crucible where the usual order was inverted, fragile and bleeding. Mary herself remained apart from the chaos, her chest rising and falling with a quiet tumult. The trace of poison's bitter residue still clung to her fingers, the faintest reminder of her quiet war waged in shadows. Her eyes, sharp and watchful, flicked between the locked doors and the murmuring crowds beyond, reading the unspoken language of fear and fractured control. How much had she gambled? And if liberty came tethered to suffering, was the cost irrevocable? In that moment, beneath the thick canopy of oppressive oaks, silence spoke volumes, heralding a reckoning that would burn longer than this night. The tension was a taut wire stretched across the brittle hearts of captive and captor alike, each breath a measured step between hope and despair. The iron chains that bound bodies with outbound spirits, wrapping tight their invisible coils around all caught within these walls. The scent of smoldering pine drifted faintly, as if the land itself bore witness to this fracture in the fabric of dominion. In the pull between silence and desperation, Mary's rebellion carved its stark silhouette, a shadow etched deep into the annals of resistance, where suffering and strength intertwined with uneasy grace. Would you bear such silent suffering? Knowing your act of revolt only deepens the chains that wrap tighter with each passing moment. This night, suspended between agony and accusation, was less a conclusion than the opening move in the long, relentless struggle etched onto the land's history. The manor walls, heavy and impenetrable, became both sanctuary and prison, a place where every heartbeat echoed with the fragile promise of freedom, yet hammered with the iron weight of consequence. Here, in the dark, the lost chapter of silent suffering whispered its unyielding truth, waiting to be unearthed. As dawn crept hesitantly over the horizon, casting pale light that struggled against the lingering shadows of the previous night, Mary stood poised on the precipice of fate. Her chest tightened with a storm of conflicting emotions, defiance twisted with fear, hope bound by dread. The poison had done its dark work. The manor's doors had been locked against tyranny, but now the question loomed: to flee into an uncertain freedom or face the brutal reckoning ahead. The heavy scent of dew-damp earth mixed with the acrid trace of burnt pine, nature's quiet witness to rebellion's fragile cusp. The air tasted sharp, with the residue of unrest, each breath weighed with the unspoken question of survival. Mary's fingers brushed the coarse weave of her worn skirt as her gaze flickered towards the path that vanished among towering oaks and tangled underbrush. The ember-red glow of the morning sun played cruel tricks on her resolve, lighting the landscape with both promise and peril. Would escape be a surge toward liberty, or a descent into harsher chains? Her heart's rhythm became a discordant drumbeat, echoing with the weight of impossible choices. Her mental battle mirrored the physical. Each step forward was measured against the invisible chains, wound tight around her soul. The distant clamor of searching voices threaded through the air, a reminder that freedom was not simply found but fought for, often at devastating cost. Shadows shifted beneath oppressive limbs. The rustle of leaves sounded like whispered threats, or perhaps fragile hopes. Mary's breath came steady only outwardly. Beneath it stirred a tempest as fierce and unpredictable as the simmering heat that hung heavily on the land. Would she bear the scars of escape or those of capture? In this crucible of choice, memory and resolve intertwined, visions of family lost to cruel hands, of whispered prayers carried on night winds, of promises made in hushed confidence beneath the canopy of stars. The firelight gleamed off iron chains left behind, cold proof of bonds broken and yet not forgotten. Every fiber of her being screamed for freedom, yet the cost was etched in every jagged line beneath the oak's gnarled boughs. The world lay beyond, vast and unknown, inviting and relentless, fierce as any lash, yet cradling the fragile pulse of hope. Mary's final breath before movement was a silent vow whispered to the oppressive woods and flickering light that no matter the path chosen, her spirit would not bend, her voice would not be silenced. Between the iron weight of captivity and the wild call of freedom, she stepped into the unfolding dawn, a figure carved from the same unyielding iron chains that sought to bind her. The road ahead was cloaked in uncertainty, but it was hers to walk, bearing the fire of rebellion in every steady heartbeat.